Hey there, it's Kari at StudioR12 Stencils. Today we're going to show you how to paint patterns, multiple colors, paint spatter using only 4 brushes. Today we are going to be working on a tone-on-tone background that is really dark and then doing a lighter color fall design over top of it. So let's go ahead and get started. The colors that we are doing for our background are number 13 and number 5. And we are going to be using the checkered background pattern with this. And this is a 1-inch pattern. So a lot of our stencils, as they grow, the pattern gets bigger. However, we have some of our pattern stencils that are specific to the size of the pattern. So with our checks, this is a 1-inch check. So whether you get a 6-inch stencil or a 15-inch stencil, the checks are always going to be 1 inch. So keep your eye on that when you are searching for things. We also have lots of smaller sizes of checks in case you are looking for a specific size, if you want really small ones, and then our 1 inch is the biggest that they get. So with our checks, we're gonna have our tone-on-tone background. So I have to decide if I want to start with the gray or start with the black. Put your guess below. Okay, we're starting with the gray. And the reason that we're starting with the gray is because the black will go over the gray better than the gray will go over the black. So think about that if you are going to be using multiple colors on your background, about which one would paint easier over the other. So we're just going to use our poly foam brush and base our board. This gray actually covers really well. So we probably only have to do 2 layers of the gray, especially since we are painting a pattern over top of it. Okay, this gray covered really nicely and only took 2 coats. So now we are ready to paint our tone-on-tone pattern, and we are going to use our black number 5. So this is not our super bold black. This is more of a gray black. There's not a ton of difference, but the number 5 is just not so deep in a black. So it's got more of a gray tone to it. So when I was choosing my stencil for the pattern, I wanted to do one that would cover my whole surface. So my surface is a 30-inch by 7 inches. And so I wanted to make sure that it was something that would cover the whole thing so I wouldn't have to move my pattern around. So with this pattern stencil, with my 1-inch checks, you have a couple of options. You can justify it left or right to align it, and then have it go off a little bit on one side or the other, or you can line it up so that you have a little bit on each side that goes off the edge. And that's where I'm going to start today, is trying to make it in the center as close as I can. I'm not going to measure it, however you could. I am going to just eyeball it here. Since my stencil is at the top, you could always tape down through your stencil or just make sure you are holding it down. I did tape twice at the bottom. So I'm going to use our big 1-inch jumbo dome brush here. Since we are only using one color, it is going to just make it a really fast process. We love this brush because it gets the work done very quickly. Going into our paint, we are offloading and then coming to our project, and we are going to swirl. So as you are doing projects like this, you can decide how many layers of paint that you want. And I have not decided that yet. So we are going to start with the 1 and see how it looks, because the 1 might look really good. It might be tone on tone and kind of get the effect that we're looking for without making the black checks too bold. Or we could do multiple layers and see a more bold pattern. So we'll do a layer and see how it looks and then decide. I do want to make that decision before I remove and move my stencil so that I don't have to try to line it up multiple times with all of the checks. All right, so we have one layer done. It's just nice and dusty. However, I think I might go ahead and just keep it that way because it's going to make it more of a soft pattern rather than a really bold pattern in the background. I do have a couple of spots where I got a little heavy-handed. Maybe I didn't offload enough, so I'm going to grab my click eraser. I'm going to put it in the water. This is a PVC eraser. It doesn't work if you just get it out and take it to your project. You have to use water on it. And I'm just gonna go through here and lightly use the water to kind of take off some of that excess paint that bled through my project. And don't forget, we are going to stencil over this, so if we do have a little bit of imperfection, the stencil could potentially cover it. And then I'm also probably going to take a sanding block through here and sand a little before I stencil, just to kind of blend it in a little bit more. So now we do have to move our pattern stencil down. And the easiest way to do this is to line up your top layer of your pattern that you've already painted, and then just go ahead and move it down. And you can see that I actually lined it up. So when I first lined it up, it was on this line, and now it's over here, and that is okay. It's just going to use a little bit more of the stencil. Making sure we're offloading really well, especially since we had a couple boo-boos on the last one, and being mindful as we're swirling that we're not applying too much pressure and that we're not really shoving our brush under those corners. When you are painting patterns, when you're painting tone on tone especially, you will want to make sure that you find a pattern to paint in so that you don't leave things out. It's kind of hard to see what we've painted and what we haven't. So I recommend starting on one stripe, going up and down all of it, or you can do left and right, but just make sure you follow the same pattern. Always make sure to check and make sure you didn't miss anything. So I'm actually going to turn this around upside down as we get to our last row, just because of where my tape is. And it looks like I am gonna have like a tiny bit down here that we will have to do one more row, but that's okay. It worked out pretty well. When you use patterns that are bigger than your surface and the larger patterns, then it doesn't take nearly as long to get them painted, and you don't have to move the stencil around. We've had some that we use teeny tiny patterns on, and they're really tedious. It does turn out really pretty, but if you are wanting to do something in a hurry, a little gift for a friend, or if you are painting for an event and you have lots to do, then you might want to think of ways to make your work faster. So this one I actually did even a little dustier than here, and I think that it's a happy accident, and I love it because then it looks like there's a bit of an ombre. So instead of going back through and changing it, I am going to leave it, and I'm going to use this as the top of my board that has a slight ombre, and then it gets a little darker as we go down. So we have just a little bit of a lighter surface here, and then it gets a little bit darker. So sometimes those happy accidents can work. If you want it to be a little more cohesive from start to finish, then you could go over that just a little bit. I'm gonna throw my jumbo dome brush in the water. I'm going to get out my super fine sanding block. This is a 220 grit, so it's super fine. And I'm just going to go over it a little bit just to kind of bring that background together. So you do see a little bit of scrapey lines. With such a long surface, you will probably want to go in small areas rather than do the whole surface as I started, because since this is so long, you might find yourself curving and you don't want to have a curved area for your sanding. All right, so what that sanding did is it made it really nice and smooth. It also helped with kind of blending this really light portion at the top. When do you use a sanding block? So you're gonna use a sanding block primarily when you want projects that are more rustic. That's when I choose you want to use one. If I want something bright and bold, I am not going to grab a sanding block because I want everything to really pop. So now we have our pattern background that is tone on tone, and we are using a Hello Fall stencil. This is STCL 5861_3. It fits perfectly on my surface, and it has, I'm going to use my tape from my Checkers, and for this one we are going to tape at the edges and tape over top of the edge, so that it wraps around and our stencil is not going anywhere. So when it comes to picking colors, we have a couple of options. Steve and I kind of had a powwow before of what colors we should use. So we have the option to do a little more of a muted fall look or a really bright and bold fall look. This is really going to be personal preference. I'm going to use the muted here just because it's not something we typically do. A lot of times when we paint fall, we paint the bright bolds. And once again, I'm going to use a jumbo dome brush because I have a nice large area, especially for the fall word. We're gonna get our paint on here, offloading, and then we're going to start our swirl. So how do you know if you've offloaded enough? When you're swirling, you should not be able to see any swirl marks. It should just look dusty, and it should not look wet. It should just look like there is a little bit of coverage. And the pressure that you are applying when you are painting this is very light. You are just really softly applying this brush to the project. The more pressure that you apply, the bigger the chance you have that you are going to bleed under. And since we didn't apply a whole lot of pressure, now that we got to the bottom, we can go back up to the top. And the top is already dry. You can see the difference as we add our second coat of paint. So a lot of times people ask, I keep getting bleeding under. How can I prevent that? So the amount of pressure that you are using is going to determine that. Also the applicator that you are using. A lot of stencilers use a flat stencil brush. We prefer a dome shape brush. So with the dome shape, only a little bit, like when I touch this brush, only a little bit is touching my finger. Instead of a flat brush, when you use a flat brush, sometimes it will push the entire brush flat when you apply the pressure, which gives you more chances of bleeding under because more of your brush is actually touching the project. And stenciling is really a layers game. It is not necessarily something that is a quick craft. So you can do a lot of quick crafts with your stencils. You can make cards, you can make wrapping paper, you can make teeny tiny little signs to hang in your room or to give as gifts. You can make ornaments. Those are all really quick crafts. But if you are making a sign for your home decor or if you are painting to sell, then you are going to want to be patient and go layer by layer. And you can do every layer as a swirl. I always do my first couple layers as a swirl, and then depending on how bright and bold I want my project to be, then I will determine if I'm going to stipple. So let's look here. We have 2 layers swirled on my project, and our hello is a little bit bolder. It's smaller, so I was able to put more paint there. And then our fall is starting to come out. I am going to do it a little bolder. So this time, As we get into our third layer, instead of swirling, now I'm going to come into a stipple. So the stipple will add a lot more coverage, a lot quicker, but it also increases your chances of bleeding under because you are applying more pressure, but you are also pushing the paint more into your brush. So there is going to be more paint lingering when you add paint later on. With this big area of the word fall, you have a couple of options. So I chose to use the brush here. You could also use a jumbo dauber or an ink sweeper to help cover that area quicker. You could even use a roller on this project because the letters are so large. All right, so now we have our third coat done with our stipple, and we're gonna take a look at it. And it isn't super bold, but our background is also not super bold. So I think that I'm going to be okay with the yellow as it is. And then I have an idea for, at the end, one thing that I want to do before I take off the stencil. So now we're going to go into our number 40. Instead of getting out a new brush, I am going to use the same brush to marry these colors together. So I'm going to go into my orange, and I'm going to do what we call neutralizing. So I have some orange on my brush, I have some yellow on my brush, and then now I'm coming to my project, or coming to my paper towel, and kind of marrying them together. And I'm just going to go ahead and start with a stipple here. When I paint designs like leaves and sprigs and greenery, I will typically always stipple those rather than swirl, especially if I am using multiple colors. And that is just because I want to go ahead and get it done at one time rather than having to keep trying to put the color back on, or if you have to move the stencil around. That way you can go ahead and get it finished and not have to worry about coming back to it. Especially if you're using multiple colors and multiple brushes, and which brush did I use for this color and which color did I use for this. So sometimes that can make it easy just to go ahead and do all one color at one time, and then you don't have to worry about that. So now our orange is getting a little more bold as we go, because the yellow has been neutralized out of it. So when we pull this stencil off, we are probably going to notice that at the bottom of our leaf is a little more orange, especially compared to the top, and that's okay because we have an ombre in the background, and now we're going to have a little bit of an ombre through our orange. So let's peel this off and see how those colors are married together. We do have a little bit of an ombre here. So you can be the one to determine if you want something to be bright and bold, or if you want to leave it as a more of a rustic farmhouse vibe. Something else that you could do here with this hello is you could add a drop shadow to it to make it really bold and pop off of that background. So now I am going to do one more thing. I'm going to throw my jumbo dome into the water, and I'm going to get out my White Wonder, and I'm going to do a little bit of a spatter. So there's a couple things you can do with picking the color of your spatter. We could use a black spatter through the large letters to kind of tie in that dark background and make it look like it's chippy and dirty and rustic. You could use an orange spatter through the yellow letters to tie all those colors together. You could use the gray so that you can bring the gray from the background. I'm going to go ahead and do black. So with our spatter, we're going to use our black paint that we already have out. And we got our White Wonder brush nice and wet, and adding it to a little bit of the paint here to make it nice and wet and inky. And I'm going to grab another brush here to use as my anchor. we always recommend spattering off a little bit onto your palette paper before you come to your project. Now, one thing I want to do, I do not want the spatter through my hello. I also do not want the spatter through my leaf. So I am going to grab a couple things here to use as masks. And this mask can be whatever you want it to be, but I'm going to use these as masks so that it only goes through the letters that I want. And I'm going to use my dome brush as my anchor, and I'm just going to very lightly spatter here. You can see the spatters are really small. If I would lower my brush toward the project, the spatters would get larger. Now, spatters take forever to dry, so keep that in mind if you're spattering. And spatters go everywhere, so don't have your light shoes on. Okay, so something that just happened, I did not move my palette before I moved my project, and it slid on my project. Luckily, it did not smear the spatters on the project itself, but it did smear them on the Mylar. So something to keep your eye on is making sure that you're going slow and paying attention. Also make sure that none of your masks get extra paint spatter on them if you're going to be moving them around. So I'm going to come back in here to my water or my paint, and I'm going to practice spatter again, make sure that it's similar to what I did above, and then we are going to spatter here through our letters. So why are we leaving our stencil on? So you have a couple of different options when you spatter. You can remove the stencil and spatter all over your entire project. And once I take the stencil off, I might decide that I do want that look, maybe want to do it in some of the corners. However, since our background has a lot already going on, I just wanted my spatter through the letters here to kind of tie in the fall, the background. So we're going to put our White Wonder in the water. And we do not leave the White Wonder in the water like we do with our other brushes. We will get it nice and wet, and then we will kind of just blot some of that paint out until it is clear on our paper towel. And then we will put it away to dry. So now it is time to take off the tape and take off our stencil. Since we have spatters and since they are wet, you have to be very careful when you take off the stencil. You don't want to drag it so we don't smear anything. I have my hand under one corner. I'm going to put my hand under the other corner, and we are going to lift straight off. And there you can see we have some spatter through our letters. We have a couple of different colors here. I do think that I might want to add something to the edges to make it a little darker. Something else we could do to bring this together, I'm going to use our special dark finishing wax. So we have a sponge that we keep in here. This is a really dark wax, and I am going to use it along the corners here and just rub it in to darken the corners. So you could also do this with the dark paint, and you could just kind of sponge it through. But the more that we add onto here, the more that it'll just kind of bring our eye to the center of the project instead of the corners here. So we're just bringing our eye to the actual art and just marrying it all together. So since we use the wax on the edges, when you are finishing this project, you will want to continue with a wax. So what I would do when all of this dries is I would go into the natural wax, or you could even use the dark wax. Know that if you use the dark wax, some of your lighter paint colors might darken up. But you could use the natural wax and then go over the whole board. Your corners are still gonna stay dark, and then you will have a nice finish. It will be protected whether you are hanging it inside and then storing it stacked on top of others, or if you are going to put it outside under a porch or a patio, the wax is still going to protect it. If you like what you saw here today and you want to add some more tips, tricks, and techniques to your craft repertoire,
Subscribe to our YouTube channel, ring the bell so you can be notified anytime we add new videos.